When will the war in Ukraine end? And are we about to face another pandemic on the scale of COVID-19? Right now, Saturn and Neptune are forming a conjunction in the sign of Pisces, and the history of these conjunctions can give us the answer to these questions. In this episode, I'm going to present some fascinating new research on Saturn and Neptune and explain what it means for Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of the world. But this video will be a little different to the usual content I present on this channel because the material is drawn from a presentation I gave during an exclusive live stream for members of World Astrology Report last month. And that presentation was followed by an Ask Me Anything style Q&A session, in which I answered questions from members on everything from the miracle of Fatima, to Neptune in Aries, to Terence McKenna's novelty theory, to the traditional Time Lord techniques, zodiacal releasing, and Fedaria. Now, one of the reasons I'm putting this presentation out on YouTube now is that I'll be giving another live presentation on Sunday, the 11th of August at 1 p.m. UTC. That's 9 a.m. Eastern Time if you're in the east of the US. In that session, I'm going to be talking about some recent developments in the world from an astrological perspective. And then I'll be taking questions from World Astrology Report members. So if you're interested in joining that session or asking me a question, then sign up as a member at my website right now at www.worldastrologyreport.com. Signing up will give you access to a growing library of exclusive ad-free content, because every video I've released since the middle of May has a special extended version featuring juicy bonus material. You'll also get access to the War Room, a forum hosting a growing community of brilliant astrologers and generally interesting people who are discussing the astrology of the world and the weird and wonderful things we talk about on this channel. The great thing about a forum is that, unlike here today, gone tomorrow social media, all the old discussions we've had there are easy to find. So we're essentially building a library of astrological knowledge that you can get access to. And members of the forum can submit questions that I'll answer on the live stream on Sunday. And if you can't make the stream live, then you'll be able to watch it and all previous streams in full on the website after it's uploaded. So I hope to see some of you soon in the stream and in the War Room. And don't worry, I will be back on YouTube with more of the usual style of high production value content very soon. Please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, the presentation that I prepared, the secret presentation, is on these guys here, Saturn and Neptune. This is not going to be an all-encompassing presentation about Saturn and Neptune. We're just going to focus on a couple of particular aspects of what these conjunctions have signified in the past, and therefore what they might be telling us about where we are now. So, two charts. You can see on the left, Saturn and Neptune's current positions. This was a snapshot taken yesterday, so Saturn and Neptune, they're currently about between 10 and 11 degrees apart, and they've been that way for pretty much the whole of June and July. They're just they're both stationed around the same time, stationed retrograde. So they've just been kind of stopped in this 10-degree aspect. Now, 10 degrees is pretty close. It's close enough to consider them conjunct, really. Richard Tarnas, he uses 15-degree orbs, up to 15 degrees for these kinds of conjunctions in doing historical research. So they are, in a sense, already conjunct, even though 10 degrees is quite far away. So what we're seeing in the world right now is already going to be reflective of this Saturn-Neptune conjunction. What that means is that we can be paying attention to what's going on and using that to kind of get an idea of what may be coming as these planets get closer and closer to conjunction and then make their exact conjunction in 2026. So on the right, you can see that I've got a chart showing the exact conjunction, 20th of February 2026 in the first degree of Aries. So, I've talked about this quite a lot already. So a quick thing on Saturn and Neptune and their meanings. They're strange bedfellows. these two planets, the things they signify are very different. They are almost diametrically opposed in certain ways. Now, I've taken a couple of quotes here from this book called Pathways to Wholeness by Ren Butler. Ren Butler is an archetypal astrologer. So he's from the School of Astrology of Richard Tarnas, who wrote Cosmos and Psyche. And his descriptions of the planets are really good. I really recommend this book and his other books as well. I find his delineations of the planets really strong, and they're really good at getting a deep insight into the archetypal meaning of these planets. I've got a couple of quotes for you here. So on Saturn, Saturn represents the elements of form, structure, and boundaries in the universe, the contracted energies that give the world its solidness and concreteness, its material substance. Without the Saturn archetype, there would be no physical definition or boundaries. Everything in the universe would exist simultaneously and overlap in a kind of unified, flowing blend of amorphous consciousness. So Saturn is that force that structures our material world, essentially. Neptune. Neptune represents the highest impulses toward unity and no boundaries in consciousness, revealing in its ultimate nature the seamless web of connection between all things in the universe. It helps us overcome the illusions of separateness between ourselves and other people, the natural world and the divine principle, unveiling the sacred energy flows permeating every part of the physical realm. Transcending apparent boundaries and divisions, Neptune can awaken experiences of blissful union and higher meaning in our perceptions of the world. So where Saturn is boundaries, Neptune is no boundaries. Neptune is the kind of oneness of consciousness. And in a lot of descriptions of the spirit world, there's this kind of idea of oneness, that, you know, time and space don't exist in the same way that they exist in our realm. So we have two very different influences here, and yet when they conjoin, they're getting merged together. Somehow what we see in the world reflects a kind of melding of the significations of these two planets. Now, this table here that you're looking at, this was generated by astroseek.com. Astroseek is a great website. I really recommend it as a free resource. You can do all sorts of things with it. It's good for historical research because you can generate tables like this. This is a table that I've generated showing every Saturn-Neptune conjunction going back to 1703. These conjunctions happen roughly every 35, 36 years. And sometimes the two planets just conjoin the once. So you can see in this table, we have 1703, 1738, 1773, 1809, and then 1846, 1846, 1846. Sometimes we get what's called a triple pass conjunction. They conjoin 3 times. This happens due to retrogrades. Most of the time they just meet once. It also happened in 1952-53 and 1989. In 2026, we only get one exact conjunction. Now, you'll note that I was talking, if you looked at the descriptions of Saturn and Neptune that I just quoted from Ren Butler, the theme of boundaries came up quite a lot. We have Saturn representing boundaries and structure. We have Neptune kind of representing no boundaries, no structure. So there's that theme is kind of common to both of them, but they reflect that theme in opposing ways. Now, back in 2022, S.J. Anderson and I made this video. It was called The Astrology of the 2020s, The New Frontier. We used the word frontier deliberately. The frontier, we were trying to invoke this theme of boundaries. Now, you can see I often try to be a bit provocative in my thumbnails. And that's really just how you play the YouTube game if you want people to actually click on your videos. And that's what I've done here a bit. You know, I've sort of circled 2026 and said it happens here. We've got Vladimir Putin. Why Vladimir Putin? Well, Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, as I've said many times on the channel, they frequently, or almost, in fact, almost always, signify big events in Russian history. Russia really resonates to Saturn-Neptune. And I've talked about some of these major events in Russian history before. We're actually going to take a slightly different angle on Russian history in this presentation to what I've talked about before. Because if we go back to this table, you'll notice that we have these 3 conjunctions in 1989, and I've pointed out many times before, as have countless astrologers, that this was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now you might say, well, that happened in Germany, but of course this was huge, had huge implications for Russia and the Soviet Union, which subsequently collapsed. If we look at these conjunctions in 1952 and 53, this was the death of Stalin, mentioned that many times, and going back to 1917, we have the Bolshevik Revolution. So those things are all very well known, but I've actually uncovered a new, well, it might not be new. The thing about astrological research is a lot of it, I think, is done and then just kind of disappears into journals or magazines and, you know, old issues, and you don't really know what other people have done. But what I've found recently is that the theme of boundaries and Russian history is crucial to these conjunctions. So, Russia and Europe, 1989, we have the fall of the Berlin Wall. We have a reconfiguration kind of the boundary of the sphere of influence of Russia and that of the West, let's say. That's a very clear, very obvious manifestation of that. Now, let's go back to 1952-53. Again, as I said before, death of Stalin, 1953. But in 1952, the East German government closed the border with West Germany, but the border between East and West Berlin remained open. East Germans could still escape through the city to the less oppressive and more affluent West, to quote I've taken from a website I found. But the key point is that the border between East and West Germany was closed in this year. So we have this theme coming up again of a kind of a boundary being formed between Russia's sphere of influence and that of the West, let's say. So we've already got 2 hits here with this theme of boundaries and Russian history. But let's see what else we can find. And I'll just take a sip. Okay, 1917. Now, thanks to World Astrology Report viewer and forum member Anna, who pointed out that in 1917 we saw the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So this was during the First World War, and it was a peace treaty that was signed on the 3rd of March 1918 between Soviet Russia and the Central Powers, to Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, by which Russia withdrew from World War I. Under the terms of the treaty, Russia lost control of Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and its Caucasus provinces of Kars and Batum. So we've got this theme coming up again here. You know, the Russian territory. What territory does Russian control? Where does its sphere of influence extend to? Now you might say, well, Dan, you're cheating a bit there. It's the treaty was signed on 3rd of March 1918, and the conjunction was in 1917. I've taken a snapshot here on this slide of the positions of Saturn and Neptune on the 3rd of March 1918. They're 4 degrees from each other, so they're still very close. They are conjunct still at this time in 1918. So we always have to remember we're working with orbs when we do this kind of historical research. You don't expect things to necessarily happen at the exact conjunction. In fact, that very rarely happens, even though you could probably draw some kind of probability distribution that would probably show that the conjunction period is maybe the time of maximum probability, with a kind of sort of bell-shaped tapering off. Now, that might or might not make sense. So I'd like to talk about that, I think, maybe in a future stream or video, this idea of like when the conjunctions manifest. But so we have another hit here for this theme of the border of Russia. Where should it be? We go back another conjunction, 1882. This was when the Triple Alliance was formed. The Triple Alliance was a defensive military alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. It was formed on the 20th of May 1882 and renewed periodically until it expired in 1915 during World War I. So this Triple Alliance was formed to try to prevent Russia from expanding into the territory of these states. So it was a defensive alliance, and it again had the theme of trying to sort of put a line between, say, this Central Europe and Russia. So we have this same theme coming up again here. Go back another conjunction, 1846. This one was a little bit more difficult. It was a bit more difficult to find evidence of this theme that I've been talking about at this time. There weren't things that leaped out, and it took a bit of research. Eventually, though, I found out something quite interesting. This was the year that a secret society called the Brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius was formed, or the Cyrillo-Methodian Society. What was this? Now, the quote that I've got here is taken from a historical book review. It says, Remy's chronological focus is on the period between 1845, when the Cyrillo-Methodian Society, the first political Ukrainian organization in modern history, was founded. So at this time, December 1945, so it would have been in orb of this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, we have this first Ukrainian nationalist organization being formed. And the echoes with today are, hardly need to be emphasized. So very interesting, and the same theme is coming up again. Because Ukrainians are essentially saying, we're not the same as you Russians, and we want, we want our own. We're our own nation, and we should have our own state. And that's back in 1846. I've leapt a bit here to 1738. I actually went through every one of these conjunctions, and there were things every time, but I don't want to labour it too long. 1738, this was the time of the Russo-Turkish War of 1735 to 1739. Austria was also involved in this war. There's a quote here, it was caused by the Ottoman Empire's war with Persia and continuing raids by the Crimean Tatars. Crimea. The war also represented Russia's ongoing struggle for access to the Black Sea. This is a theme that we've seen coming up again in the current conflict. So Russia always wants access to the Black Sea. Now, in 1739, a treaty was signed in which the Russians gave up their claim to Crimea and Moldavia, but they were allowed to build a port at Azov. They're without fortifications and without the right to have a fleet in the Black Sea. Again, same theme coming up again at another one of these conjunctions. And here's another quote from the Wikipedia page on this war. The Russian army had to leave Ochakov and Kinburn due to a plague outbreak. That's quite interesting. And we'll talk more about what that means in a bit. This is just a map that I found, just showing how over history there's been a lot of changes to the extent of Russia, both to the east and to the west. And if you think about Saturn-Neptune, Saturn-Neptune is kind of about giving structure to sort of amorphous things, oceanic things. And in this case, it's almost like these conjunctions have to do with putting a boundary on Russia, this thing that whose extent keeps changing throughout history, and where the extent of it isn't really clear. The thing about Russia, particularly in the West, the western boundary of Russia, is that there's no, like where it currently stands, there's no kind of physical feature that really bounds Russia in. If you look at a lot of countries, there are obvious, very prominent geographical features which make the kind of extent of that country quite natural. So think about like the border between Spain and France, right? We have a mountain range, you know, that kind of makes the border between those two countries very obvious. But the mountains in Europe that could sort of divide off Russia are actually quite far to the west. I think you have to go all the way into Poland, which is why the Poles are always so worried about being invaded by the Russians, which of course has happened many times before. Now, you notice the reference to plague there in 1738. There was a plague in 1738. The Great Plague of 1738 was an outbreak of the bubonic plague between 1738 and 1740 that affected areas of the Habsburg Empire, now in the modern nations of Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, Serbia, Croatia, Slovakia, Czechia, and Austria. Although no exact figure is available, the epidemic likely killed over 50,000 people. Now, that year there was, as we've seen, a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. I've got a little snippet here showing where it took place. It was at the first degree of Cancer. You might note this is one of the world points that Bill Meridian was talking about that are very important in Uranian astrology and signify things that are going to have like worldwide effects or widespread effects. So we have a conjunction at one of these world points, and we have something important around Russia, and we also have a plague outbreak. That's a little bit ominous. Now, what I've done here is I've looked at the Rules for Planetary Pictures, which is the Uranian textbook that gives delineations for every combination of planets that you can think of. Now, Saturn, Neptune, this is what it says for Saturn, Neptune. Losses or separation through deception or fraud, habit, things of long duration, sickness, treacherous diseases, chronic ill health, pestilence, chronic conditions, fraud, theft, losses, pestilence, or plague. So that's not very cheery, but the theme of pestilence and plague comes up a lot. This is actually something that Bill mentioned in the video that I did with him as well. So there's good news and bad news here. What I did is I looked at these conjunctions again to see if did we see epidemics, did we see pandemics at these conjunctions? So rather than just taking, the rule book at its word, it's always important to just check and see, well, does that really play out? Now, the good news and bad news that here is that you don't see huge pandemics at every one of these conjunctions or anything like that. So from that perspective, that's good news. However, it does seem that there is a correlation between these conjunctions and certainly epidemics and notable outbreaks of disease of differing extent, but it does seem to happen pretty much every time. So if we go back to 1989, which we already looked at as the year that the Berlin Wall fell, I've pulled this up from the BBC's website on the forgotten flu epidemic of 1989. In 1989, a flu epidemic took hold in Scotland, causing disruption to the education of young people and the hospital care of others, as many teachers and nurses were off sick. More people in Scotland died at the height of the 89 epidemic than at the peak of the first wave of COVID-19 in 2020. So that's quite striking. There would have been other things that happened in other parts of the world, but that was something that caught my eye. Now, there was no world global pandemic that year, but there was that. Now, we go back to 1952 to 1953. There was a polio epidemic at this time. Polio is a really terrible and frightening disease. It's quite uncommon now, actually because of vaccination, but it was something that a lot of people were afraid of. It can cause terrible wasting to the limbs. And this is just a quote here. In the United States, the 1952 polio epidemic was the worst outbreak in the nation's history. The same year, there was also a big flu epidemic. Another quote here: a widespread epidemic of influenza caused by virus A occurred in the Northern Hemisphere during the winter of 1952 to 53. So here we have another hit there. 1917, well, in February 1918, we had the outbreak of Spanish flu, which by now pretty much we all know about. In February 1918, Saturn and Neptune were still 6 degrees away from each other, so they're still essentially conjunct. And that's a big hit there for this correlation between Saturn, Neptune, and disease. So I looked back. I actually looked back into the further into the past, and I found epidemics pretty much every time of different sizes. It gets a little bit dicey here though, because back in the past there was just a lot more disease around. This was just a lot more common, so it gets a bit more difficult to say how unusual it is when you've got, say, some big outbreak of a disease somewhere in the world, because the further you go back in the past, you get to a point where there was basically always something. So I didn't go back, or haven't presented that stuff here, but I did see correlations. Now, June and July 2024. So as I noted at the start of this presentation, the two planets were 10 degrees away from each other. They still are 10 to 11 degrees away from each other. And so this was basically a kind of preview period of what this conjunction might be signifying. So we should be looking at the events that have happened over the last couple of months, and especially those that have to do with the Saturn-Neptune themes. Obviously a lot of things are going to have happened. Say, what happened today with Donald Trump, that's not relevant to Saturn-Neptune. So we don't factor that in. We look for things that have the feel of these two planets together, that match the archetypal symbolism. Now, some things that I noted, there were a lot of developments around the war in Ukraine. Some sort of more optimistic, some less optimistic. So, for example, there was this summit on peace in Ukraine, attended by a lot of countries of the world, notably not attended by Russia or China. So, how positive was this thing? Really, I'm not sure, but it did happen. And it did kind of evidence that there was some sort of interest in trying to put an end to this war. And I've just collected some headlines here that I found over the last month or two. So here's one: Putin is prepared to share Crimea with Ukraine, according to a new peace plan that has been presented by Russia to the US. So that's an interesting one here. But then we also have Biden and Zelensky signed 10-year bilateral security agreement. So this is a real commitment from the US saying, we're not going to drop our support for Ukraine in this war. We have another one: Poland and Baltic states request defense line on border with Russia and Belarus. So this theme of border lines, where should the border with Russia go? They're actually asking for some kind of new line, some sort of, I'm not sure exactly what it will be, but some defensive line to be put up to, to sort of essentially to keep the Russians out. And then we have Biden administration moves toward allowing American military contractors to deploy to Ukraine. So we kind of, this period, from what I can tell, we simultaneously have sense of like escalating of the conflict and also some hints of an end to it as well. So what can we conclude from that? Well, the way I'm thinking about this is that what I think we can tell from all this history and from this recent news is that we are probably going to see an end to this conflict during this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, and it's going to result in a new borderline essentially being fixed with between Russia and the West, let's say. Now, where will that borderline be? Not clear. But what I've got here, you can see Saturn and Neptune in a chart here. This is April 2027, and you can see that here Saturn has gotten to 15 degrees away from Neptune by this point. So by this time, it's really, the conjunction is kind of pretty much over. So that, I think, gives us a kind of latest point for when this war, I think, could be over. That said, I think it's quite possible that it might escalate before it ends. And another thing that I take from this is that it suggests to me that the war's not, that particular conflict probably isn't going to expand massively into Western Europe or into other states, I'm guessing. And the reason I'm saying that is just because I think if it did, that would probably prolong the war a lot. Say if Russia and Poland somehow went to war and the Russians pushed into Europe and whatnot, that if that happens, this conflict's not ending that quickly, in my opinion. So I take some hope from that, in that, that as horrible as this war is, it will probably be more or less contained, and we have a kind of, I think, a sort of latest date for when it will be over. Probably earlier than this, probably closer to the exact conjunction, and these planets are going to be very close to conjunct from quite early next year. Now, what else did we see of these themes that we've been talking about in June and July? Well, we saw a lot of news about bird flu. There's a lot of stories coming out talking about this sort of bird flu apparently spreading from cows. It's taken a dangerous step towards infecting humans through respiration. Bird flu could become a human pandemic. How are countries preparing, etc.? We have to be ready for the potential that we could see another pandemic. Will it be on the scale of what we saw in COVID? We don't know. But I find that this news about bird flu is kind of an omen. It's because of the timing is right. So I think the possibility that there could be another pandemic is quite high. It's not, nothing's for certain. Now, the other reason I kind of suspect that we are going to get more pandemics, I mean, firstly, of course, we've always had pandemics and epidemics and so on, diseases. Disease is just a feature of human history. But also because we saw these themes come into the world at the time of the pandemic, and they weren't just about the pandemic itself. It was the story of the pandemic was about how would the pandemic be managed. And obviously we had vaccines, but the vaccines were also attached to a kind of bureaucratic technological infrastructure. So you had to have a QR code. If you wanted to travel, you had to show it. You had proof of vaccine, etc., etc. So there was this kind of, these mechanisms were being put in place, and I don't think those things are going to go away. We're not hearing much about them now because they're not really relevant. Life feels like it's gone back to normal. But for the kind of storylines that began in that pandemic to continue, and cycles tell us that they will continue, I think we need events in the world that kind of move it forward somehow. And I've got some other stories here from that period, from the period of the pandemic, and particularly around the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions of 2020. The Bahamas launched the world's first CBDC. It was called the Sands Dollar in October 2020, very close to a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Another headline: why has the COVID-19 pandemic increased support for universal basic income? Governments were giving a lot of payouts to people because of the stuttering economies, and rightly so, I think, given that people were forced to close their businesses and so on. But this has kind of raised this idea of universal basic income could be a feature of this cycle. And then, of course, another headline: global pandemic treaty to be concluded by 2025, WHO says. So there's the pandemic treaty, which they failed to push through quite recently. They were trying to get it agreed upon at the recent health conference. It didn't work, so now it's been postponed to 2025. So all of these themes, I think, are going to be part of the story, and a fresh pandemic would kind of move these themes forward, because I think right now there's quite a lot of opposition to CBDCs. A lot of people don't see the need for them. And I suspect that there will probably be some sort of crisis which kind of drives these things forward. And I don't necessarily mean that in a kind of conspiratorial sense. I just mean it in the sense that something is needed to kind of bring these storylines forward in a sort of almost cosmic sense. I don't mean to say that these things are inevitable, but I think a kind of a negotiation or a battle, if you like, over whether they should be done, what they should, how totalizing they should be, is probably in the works. And just one more last remark here. Not long now, the conjunctions, I've talked a lot about February 2026 as being the time of the exact Saturn-Neptune conjunction. But really, Saturn and Neptune are going to be very close to conjunction well before that, in July 2025. This is a chart showing their positions, 15th of July. They're just 13 minutes from each other. So stuff is actually coming very soon. We don't have to wait to 2026 for it to be present. So that's it for the presentation. Remember, if you want to join the next live stream, become a World Astrology Report member at www.worldastrologyreport.com right now. Thanks, and see you next time.